Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell. Hey, Tia.
Hey, Greg.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has handed down a major voting rights ruling that could reshape and will reshape political maps across the South, really across the country, including, of course, here in Georgia. The decision weakens a key legal tool in the Voting Rights Act, long used to challenge maps that dilute Black voting strength. And almost immediately, Georgia Republicans began pushing for a redraw of the state's congressional and legislative districts that could flip at least one, maybe two U.S. House seats and strengthen the Republican Party's grip on the General Assembly. Congressman Buddy Carter and other Republicans are already urging Kemp to call lawmakers back to Atlanta for a special session.
Well, first of all, I applaud the Supreme Court for the decision they made. They made the right decision. Race should never be considered in drawing congressional districts. And I'm glad that Tennessee and Alabama are redrawing their districts. And I think that Georgia should do the same thing. Yes, we have started early voting. And yes, it would be inconvenient. But at the same time, it's never too late to do the right thing. And the right thing is for the governor and for the legislature to call a special session to redistrict so that Georgians will be represented by people who represent their values.
The governor says it's too late to change maps for the 2026 election cycle. Candidates have already qualified. Early voting is well underway. More than 270,000 people have already cast their ballots. And the May 19th primary is right around the corner. But he also made something else very clear to you. He said Georgia will need new maps before 2028. And that's where this gets really politically explosive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is clear that Georgia is going back to the drawing board, literally, for maps, not just congressional, but state House, state Senate. We should look for new maps. I think Sanford Bishop knows that his congressional district in rural southwest Georgia is likely the one on the chopping block, but you can expect the seats currently represented by Hank Johnson, Nikema Williams, and David Scott may be condensed from 3 to 2. Lucy McBath's seat is not necessarily a majority Black seat. It's very heavily Hispanic and Asian as well up in Gwinnett County. So that might be a little bit different. But we can expect to see a lot of redrawing of the maps that could ultimately reduce the number of Democrats. And right now, all of our Democrats in Congress are Black. I do think it's worth pointing out Buddy Carter's soundbite saying that race should not be a factor. Everything we've heard, and I know we'll be talking to a professor later in this episode, but everything we heard is that race has and will continue to be a factor in redistricting, including maps drawn by Republicans. They just say it's partisan, but because our politics are so divided among racial lines that the minute you draw a partisan map, you're also drawing a racially influenced map. And just because Republicans say they're not doing it doesn't make it true.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tia. And let's look at our delegation. 9-5 split right now, of course, with the vacant seat for the late David Scott, Democrat from Atlanta. There's talk among Republicans, at least one, maybe two seats. Technically, maybe you could even get to 3 if you're them looking at maps. But 1 or 2 is likely what we're looking at. We could have a special session this year, but it would affect maps in 2028. It would not affect the maps this year. Every Republican I talk to, sort of privately says the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest target, the clearest target is Democratic Congressman Sanford Bishop, who you've covered for years. He's represented that Southwest Georgia district that stretches parts of Albany, Columbus. It sometimes even, dips into middle Georgia. It's been redrawn a few times. It is a narrowly Democratic district, right? But because he's an incumbent, he's served 17 terms. He's the ranking veteran on the in Georgia's congressional delegation. He has won handily every cycle, but this might be his last easy victory coming up.
Yeah, he has shown that he can carry that district, even though it is, quite frankly, it was drawn to be less Democratic, and Republicans thought they could get him out of there after the last redrawing. It didn't happen. And they know, I think Democrats know, that it's partially because of the incumbency power of Sanford Bishop, his reputation, the fact that his name recognition is high, the fact that he has these long-standing relationships with leaders in that region. Mm-hmm. That would be hard for any Democrat to replicate, even under the current map. So I think it'll be interesting. The thing that I will find so interesting, Greg, about this whole redistricting conversation is when you make a district less Democratic, those Democratic voters have to go somewhere. Mm-hmm. And what you end up doing is making other Democrats that were maybe super conservative a little bit less so. And we saw that with Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, when they drew her district, they put more Democrats in her district, partially to punish her, partially to, quite frankly, make Barry Loudermilk's seat more safe because it was getting to that toss-up area. So at the end of the day, there are cities all around Georgia that are heavily Democratic. And it's quite frankly, in Sanford Bishop's district, you have rural Georgia counties that are quite diverse. Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, the generations of Black people that descend from the plantations and the farms whose ancestors were once sharecroppers and slaves still live in those rural areas. And they're Black and they tend to vote Democratic. And it's going to be interesting to see how those districts get drawn in ways that still keep other seats safe for Republicans.
Mm-hmm. In 2010, or 2011, when Republican lawmakers redrew Georgia's maps, the suburbs were red, right? And by the end of the decade, the suburbs were blue, and that's why Karen Handel was defeated by Lucy McBath, and why John Ossoff came so close to defeating Karen Handel in that special election. And so things change, right? And the risk Republicans run if they try to go too far, they can. Sanford Bishop's district seems like that's. Again, Republicans see that as low-hanging fruit here, right? Is that they can make minor modifications and draw that to be very competitive for Republicans, especially if Sanford Bishop is not the incumbent. But when you get to those Metro Atlanta districts, as you said, and you try to draw one of those Democratic-leaning districts to be a Republican-leaning district, you make all the other districts around them slightly more competitive, especially if you add in the fact that the suburbs flip blue. The exurbs are not nearly as red as they used to be. Democrats, when they're looking to make up ground, they're now looking at Forsyth County, Cherokee County, still deep red counties, but a little pinker than they used to be, Tia.
Yeah. And again, Democrats are hopping mad. Yeah. And Democrats right now seem to be much more enthusiastic about voting. We're seeing that with early voting ahead of the primary. And that may be because I was going to say maybe because Democrats have more interesting races on the primary ballot, but not true. Republicans have very competitive primaries.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fact that Democrats right now in early voting are voting at a higher rate than Republicans appears to be an enthusiasm difference. And we'll see how that plays out. But again, all this redistricting stuff and people saying, hey, I think this is going too far could have an effect down the line, but it could be after drastic changes are made.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, what did the Supreme Court actually say? How much of the Voting Rights Act is still standing? And what options do Georgia and federal lawmakers have now? We're going to ask constitutional law professor Eric Segall after the break. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Tia Mitchell. We here at the AJC are gearing up for our first ever AJC Subscriber Week. And to kick it off, we're hosting a Politically Georgia happy hour at Manuel's Tavern, our favorite, on May 15th. Patricia, Tia, and I will be talking through what's ahead in the primary, possible runoffs, and of course, November elections. Come have a drink, ask us questions, and join our conversation. The event is exclusive to AJC subscribers, so if you are an AJC subscriber, we hope you are, check your inbox. We'd love to see you there. Okay. To help us unpack what the Supreme Court actually decided and what it could mean for Georgia voters on redistricting, political maps, and future elections, we're now joined by Professor Eric Segall, constitutional law professor at Georgia State University. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's get to it, because for listeners who don't live and breathe redistricting law or political maps, explain the practical impact. Why does this really matter so much for states like Georgia?
Well, this case matters as much as any case decided by the Supreme Court in a long time. Every 10 years, used to be every 10 years, states would redistrict for purposes of the House of Representatives and state houses after the census. Now, of course, we're doing redistricting during that 10-year period because President Trump asked Texas to do so. Georgia actually is in a slightly different position than most other states. So we have, I think, 5 majority-minority districts. And what that means is a district where a majority of the people are people of color or minorities. And that's a lot. Georgia is about 33% black, and we have 5 seats that are relatively safe. That's highly unusual in the South. So, for example, in Louisiana, Mississippi, they have far fewer districts like that. Mm-hmm. What this case does is it basically ends majority-minority districts if the state legislature wants to end them. The Voting Rights Act, which you were talking about before, at times required majority-minority districts under Congress's power to enforce the 15th Amendment, which of course says there'll be no race discrimination in voting. And Congress is allowed to pass laws that are appropriate to the goal of ending race discrimination in voting. And so the Voting Rights Act, especially the one that was amended in 1982, basically says that any procedure that makes it more difficult for minorities to vote violates the law. Well, what the Supreme Court held in Calais is when you redistrict based on race, and the way that Louisiana did in that case, you can only do that if there's a clear violation of the Voting Rights Act. And then the court made a huge move. It said you have to show intent. And that's not what Congress said, that in any way, shape, or form. But now if somebody wants to challenge a district in Georgia, for example, that is majority-minority, the only justification for the majority-minority district would be to comply with the Voting Rights Act. What the court said is you don't have to do this to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And then the court said, if you redistrict based on race, it's unconstitutional. So it's going to go a long way in ending the idea that we create majority-minority districts, which will, if this carries forward, as many people think it will, in the long run, lead us to a pre-1965 world where there are virtually no black representatives from the South in Congress and far fewer in state houses.
And a quick follow-up, even if the effect in Georgia is muted, different than, let's say, Mississippi or Alabama or wherever, there's still very likely that there'll be at least one fewer Democratic-leaning seat in Georgia, if not maybe 2.
I would think at least 2 going forward, but not for this election. I mean, no. Mississippi and Louisiana, Alabama, I think, they're all considering redistricting at this very late moment, and in ways that are going to be very unfair to Democrats, which was the whole point, frankly, of the Supreme Court decision. Governor Kemp came out pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
And said there's not going to be any redistricting in the state because he has to sign on to any redistricting. That's typical. Georgia generally is a little bit more balanced when it comes to these issues. And I think a part of that is this long and very beneficial relationship in some ways between the power structure and the black middle class here.
So you just said that, the only way to keep these majority-minority districts is if you justify them as complying with the Voting Rights Act. But you can't say the district was drawn with race in mind. So what could states like Georgia say, if anything, to justify a majority-minority district at this point that you think could possibly be defended?
Well, the problem is the Georgia legislature is unlikely to draw any new majority-minority districts, and they're likely to take away at least 2, if not more. One of the complications in Georgia is it's very difficult to see how Fulton County could be divided up in ways that wouldn't threaten Republican seats in other places. It will happen, but it's going to be walking a tightrope. But the real answer to your question is in blue states, when they want to California, when they want to create more majority minority districts, they will be able to do that, because what they're going to say is, we're not redistricting based on race, we're redistricting based on partisan affiliation. And it just so happens that Black people and Hispanic people and other people vote Democrat more than white people. As long as you utter the words, we're doing this because of partisan reasons to elect our incumbents or elect new people in our party rather than race, you'll get away with it. The problem is the Deep South isn't going to do that. With the exception of Georgia, it is very unlikely that Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina is going to do that. Now, in states with Democrat governors, it gets more complicated because they can veto maps. What the Supreme Court did, and is very intentional, is it said you can't challenge partisan redistricting and you can't challenge racial redistricting if the reason is for partisan reasons. It is true that Democrats can use that in blue states in the same way that Republicans can use it in red states. The problem is one of those political parties, the Republican Party, is way ahead of the Democratic Party in the history of doing this and how it's going to play out.
So along those lines, one of the questions I had when we were talking amongst our AJC colleagues the day the ruling came out is, in the South, they're going to be, a state like Louisiana or Mississippi that has a very large African-American population. I think it's 30 or 40% in those states.
Louisiana, I think, is 33. Yeah, 30%.
Yeah, 33%. So about a third of the state's population is Black people, and they have no Black representation. Do you think there's a universe where the voting rights groups and the civil rights groups can say, hey, Supreme Court, we can prove that race was a factor in getting all these white districts, right? Or is that not how it works?
No, because what Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and probably Georgia, when it cuts back some of the majority minority districts, what they're going to say is, we're not cracking and packing these people because of race. We're cracking and packing these people, meaning dispersing them so they have no power, or putting all of them in one place so they have very limited power. We're doing that because that's better for the Republican Party. And what the Supreme Court has said is, if the answer is we're doing this because it's better for the Republican Party, or hypothetically the Democratic Party, then that's not unconstitutional. So no one can challenge that. So all those additional white districts that are going to be created in those states, and the majority minority districts that are going to be taken away, the defense is going to be, we didn't do this because of race. We did this because of partisan affiliation. And in the Rucho case in 2019, which Georgia lawyer Emmett Bondurant argued and sadly lost in the Supreme Court on behalf of Common Cause, the Supreme Court said, even if there's a close correlation between partisan affiliation and race, and of course there's an incredibly close connection between partisan affiliation and race, even if that's true, you cannot challenge partisan affiliations in federal redistricting in federal court. Those kind of cases, the court said, can't come here. So all the governments have to do is say, we're not doing this because of race, we're doing this because of partisanship. And that's going to be very hard to get behind. And all of this goes back to what Justice Alito did in Calais, which is he basically overruled Congress. Congress in 1982 said you don't have to prove intent. You just have to prove the effect of a districting change or a voter ID law or whatever has a negative effect on minority voters. Just the effect. And the Congress did that in 1982 because in 1980, the Supreme Court misinterpreted the law and said you have to show intent to discriminate. Congress said, you got that wrong, Supreme Court. We're going to amend the law and prove it. A young lawyer named John Roberts tried to convince Congress not to do that, and he lost that battle. He won the war, but he lost the battle. No, in the future, redistricting in general is going to be outside of federal court's ability to monitor. And the whole purpose of the Voting Rights Act. I heard a statistic from Sherilyn Ifill, the wonderful, former head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She was on Jon Stewart, and Sherilyn said that in 1964 there were like 75 elected Black leaders in the country nationwide. I'm talking, the whole country, every level of government. And the Voting Rights Act made that number go way, 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 way up. It's not just about Congress, and it's not just about the Georgia, House and Senate or other states' House and Senates. This is going to affect school boards, county governments, all over the place, where since 1965 and mostly since 1982, they have not been able to change their election procedures to hurt minorities if the effect was to hurt minorities. But now when they change their procedures, which they will do, to make it more difficult to elect people of color to school boards and county commissions and that kind of thing, now you have to prove intent. And, in 2026, very few people are frankly dumb enough to leave breadcrumbs of racial intent, in the evidence. So it's going to be almost impossible to challenge redistricting going forward.
Yeah. Let me ask you about that because, Republicans are acting swiftly, obviously, in states surrounding Georgia. In Louisiana, they're talking about eliminating. I think it looks like they're going to preserve one of the Democratic districts, but eliminate the other Democratic-held district. Alabama might eliminate all of its Democratic-held districts. South Carolina might get there too. Tennessee looks like it will as well. Democrats are kind of countering, saying, this is a call to action. This is a call to vote. Turn out like you've never turned out before to fight this. But is there let's say Democrats do flip the House. Is there anything that Democrats in Congress can do to counteract this? Or is it just locked into law the way it is with the Supreme Court ruling?
Congress has authority to regulate elections at the end of the day. So elections for Congress anyway. So yes, theoretically, Congress could do Congress could outlaw partisan redistricting tomorrow. Congress could do that, but that would take the House, the Senate, plus getting over the filibuster, plus a presidential signature or a veto over. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in my life. It's not going to happen for a very long time. So I think what's going to happen and what's happening in Florida as we speak, I guess Governor DeSantis signed a redistricting thing very quickly after the case. That's going to go to the Florida Supreme Court or the Florida courts under state law and state constitutions. So where the real battlegrounds are going to be, I think, are state constitutions and state law. And I'll just add, without commenting on it editorially, this election for Georgia Supreme Court justices that we're having right now in Georgia, where two people have challenged two incumbents. I think you're going to see more and more of this, because state Supreme Courts are going to be where the action is, because statewide elections you can't rig through redistricting, because they're it's the whole state. It's like United States Senator. So I think we're going to see a lot of action in the state court.
Interesting. Tia, you want to wrap it up?
I know you're also someone who can talk a little bit about history. And you mentioned that, at the height of the civil rights movement, there were 75 Black elected officials nationwide. I would argue Georgia probably has 75 or more today. Probably more than that today, I would argue, in just Georgia. But I think that part of this trend, in conservatism is attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And people are going to listen to this podcast and say, so what? You don't need to just have Black representation for Black representation's sake. And that just shows you that it was rigged just to get more Black people elected. So can you talk a little bit about the history as to why at the time our Congress felt that it was important to level the playing field so that Congress and other state and local bodies better reflected the communities they represent?
I would love to. That's a great question. If I have 3 to 5 minutes, I can do it. It's what it takes to answer that question, in any kind of way. So after the Civil War and the 15th Amendment is passed, that says you can't discriminate on the basis of race in voting, it worked. It worked. Louisiana sent a Black person to Congress right after, in the 1870s or something, and it worked for 10 or 15 years. And then it stopped working. And the Supreme Court got out of the enforcement business. And the way it went was, and everyone knows this, in the southern states and other places. Don't get me wrong. This is as much a problem outside of Chicago and outside of Boston as it was in the Deep South. But mostly in the Deep South and some other urban areas. White people used literacy tests White people used character tests. White people used violence, as we all know, terrible violence, to stop black voters from registering, from stopping black people from voting. I show in my class the literacy test that was used by some of the southern states in the late 1950s, 1960s. I would have no chance of passing that test, 0 chance. The tests actually were not passable. They were so subjective and weird. So Martin Luther King, along with John Lewis and other civil rights heroes, went to Lyndon Johnson after John F. Kennedy was assassinated and said, we have to have a Civil Rights Act in 1964. That happened. And we have to have a Voting Rights Act. And that was the more controversial one of those two things. And they fought and they fought and they got it. And the main purpose, the history before this was some federal courts would strike down formal election mechanisms that made it harder for people of color to vote. But then the next day, the city or the town or the state would do the same thing in different form. So it never worked. So the Voting Rights Act was a reaction to all of that. And in addition to Section 2, which we're talking about today, the best part of the Voting Rights Act was one that said states and counties with a long history of racial discrimination in voting had to pre-clear election changes with a federal court in D.C. Or the Department of Justice. That was incredibly successful. And of course, John Roberts gutted that in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, and we lost Section 5 pre-clearance, which was a major blow. This is a package. This is the second punch, or maybe the third punch in the fight. And again, I think Georgia is a little bit of an anomaly because of Atlanta's international importance and domestic importance as a major American city, and just because of how Atlanta grew up. But for the rest of the South, there is every reason to think. So Louisiana might retain one majority minority district just to show that it has, but that's ridiculous. It's 30%, black, whatever it is. I don't expect the same grace from Alabama, Mississippi, and maybe South Carolina, not sure. And it's going to affect rural districts all over the country, Chicago, Boston, Seattle, and all of the gains of the Voting Rights Act. What the Roberts Court has done and said to the American people is, we don't think the Voting Rights Act is necessary. In fact, we think it's a bad thing to the extent it requires majority minority districts, and we're going to overturn it. And let me just say, I know this show is not supposed to be editorial, but as someone who studied the Supreme Court for 35 years, these justices in the majority who claim to be textualists and originalists, they read Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in a way that no credible person can read it. Congress was very clear. You don't have to show intent. And this case basically says you have to show intent. So just showing the effects of an election change hurt people of color, which was the standard before. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to show other things too, but that was the main thing you had to show. You're never going to be able to prove intent in 2026. It's going to be very, very difficult. But it's not going to stop, and this is the saddest thing of all to me, whatever political party one is, legislatures are allowed to use race to redistrict, and they're going to. They're just going to call it partisanship, but they're using race. But judges will not be able to use race to remedy that problem. And if you don't see that as a one-way ratchet to help the majority, white people, and hurt the minority, people of color, then you're not understanding what's going on. That is the intent of this. Although I will also say this Supreme Court has shown over and over again that in any issue that involves the Republican Party, they're going to make a ruling that helps the Republican Party. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has gone around the country saying that in election cases, since John Roberts was confirmed and Justice Alito was confirmed, the Republican Party has won 100% of the time in these cases. That's actually not true. It's not 100%. It's about 98%.
It's pretty close. Professor Segall, you said this was the third blow to the Voting Rights Act. It sounds like it is the knockout blow. Thank you so much for joining us for your analysis and your opinions on this case. We really appreciate it. The history lesson as well.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you have a question about Georgia politics, you can call the Politically Georgia call-in hotline anytime. Leave a question, and we'll play it back and answer your question right here on the show during our Monday mailbag. If it's about redistricting, we're going to have Professor Segall come back and answer that question as well. The number is 770-810-5297. You can also email us at politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share Politically Georgia with a friend. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.